Hello, and welcome back to Architecture Topics. I'm Liam Karen, and today we're stepping into the heart of ancient Athens. We'll be exploring a building that's so iconic, so seemingly eternal, that we often forget it was built by human hands with politics, ego, and ambition carved into every stone. I'm talking about the Parthenon, the architectural embodiment of an entire civilization's ideals. But very quickly, before we jump in, if you appreciate this kind of content, please take a moment to follow Architecture Topics on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or wherever you are listening. It only takes a moment, and it's a big signal for us to keep producing more content. Excellent. Thank you for your support. Now let's dive right into it. Before we talk about the Parthenon, we need to understand the Acropolis, the stage upon which this story unfolds. The Acropolis isn't just a hill, it's a pedestal, a sacred stony stage that towers nearly 150 meters above the city of Athens. Its name literally means high city, from the Greek akron, meaning edge or extremity, and polis, which means city. But for the ancient Athenians, it was more than just geography. It was memory, myth, and pride. People had been settling here since Neolithic times, but by the 5th century before Christ, the Acropolis had become something else entirely. It had become a spiritual and political heart, a space reserved for the gods and for the stories about the city. At its center was the old temple of Athena Polius, home to a sacred wooden statue of the goddess. But in 480 BC, everything changed. The Persian army swept into Athens and burned the Acropolis to the ground, leveling its temples and leaving its sacred stones in ruins. But rather than rebuilding it immediately, the Athenians left the site as it was for decades. It served as a kind of open wound, a reminder of the humiliation they had suffered and the vengeance they still carried. Athens eventually won the war against Persia and little by little started recovering, not just militarily, but artistically, politically, and culturally. By the mid-5th century BC, Athens wasn't just one more city-state in Greece. It was leader of the Delian League, victorious over the Persians, and rich with tribute money flowing in from across the Aegean. And at the center of it all was Pericles. He wasn't a king. Athens was a democracy after all, but he held enormous influence. Charismatic, calculating, and utterly convinced that Athens was destined for greatness. He knew the power of symbols and spectacle, and he had a plan. He set his sights on rebuilding the Acropolis, not as it had been, but as something greater. A stage not just for worship, but for Athenian identity. And at its heart, there would be a new temple to Athena, the Parthenon. It would be the largest temple ever built in mainland Greece. And it would be funded, controversially, using the so-called defense funds of the Delian League. Money meant to defend all of Greece was now funding marble monuments for Athens. Critics, then and now, have called it imperial theft. But Pericles saw it differently. He believed Athens had earned the right to lead and to show that leadership through architecture. He entrusted the project to two architects, Iktinos and Callicrates, and the artistic direction to Phidias, the most famous sculptor of the age, and also a close friend of Pericles. Construction began in 447 BC. Astonishingly, the main structure was finished by 438 BC. That's just 9 years. For a building this large, this refined, and in an age of no machinery, that speed is almost unbelievable. It wasn't just efficiency, it was urgency. A political performance played out in stone. From a distance, the Parthenon looks almost simple, rectangular, balanced, predictable. But the closer you look, the stranger and more astonishing it becomes. Let's start with the basics. The Parthenon is about 69.5 meters long and 30.9 meters wide, with a height just over 13.7 meters at the top of the colonnade. The outer row has 46 massive columns, 8 on the short sides, 17 on the long. Each one stands around 10.4 meters tall and nearly 2 meters in diameter. Those numbers matter because they're not just big, they're precisely big. Every proportion in the Parthenon is calibrated with obsessive care. It follows a kind of invisible mathematical harmony. The proportion between the length and the width, the spacing of the columns, the dimensions of the inner sanctuary, the rhythm of the entablature. It all adheres to a set of ratios that speak to balance, order, and control. Inside, the Parthenon was divided into 2 main rooms. The larger, central space, the naos, was where the magic happened. It held a colossal gold and ivory statue of Athena, designed by Phidias. She stood nearly 12 meters tall, armored and crowned, holding Nike, the goddess of victory. It wasn't just a devotional object, it was a show of wealth. A treasury in sculpture form. But more about that in a moment. First, let's finish the tour. Behind this space, separated by a solid wall, was a smaller chamber, sometimes called the Opisthotomos. This served as a treasury and wasn't open to the public. Here, offerings and tribute from Athens and its allies were stored. So while the Parthenon looked like a traditional temple from the outside, it didn't quite behave like one. There's evidence that it wasn't used much for ritual sacrifice. There was no central altar and no open-air space for crowds to gather and watch. It was more like a sacred showroom, a carefully staged environment where the Athenians could display their power, piety, and cultural superiority. In that sense, it wasn't just a temple. It was a message. But that's not everything. There's a twist. This perfect temple is not perfect at all. At least not in the most strict sense of the word, because none of it is actually straight. Let's start with the platform, the stylobate. If you laid a level across it, you'd notice something strange. The center is slightly higher than the edges. This upward curvature, barely noticeable to the eye, was designed to correct an illusion. On a long, flat surface, the human eye tends to perceive the middle as sagging. So by subtly raising the center, the architects made it appear level. Then there are the columns. If they were perfectly vertical, our eyes would see them as ever so slightly leaning outward, like they're falling away from the building. So the architects tilted them inward, just a fraction of a degree, so they appear straight. But not only that, if the sides of a column are perfectly straight, to the human eye, they will look thinner in the middle. This is the same illusion as the flat platform appearing sagging at the center, but in the vertical axis instead of the horizontal. So the architects gave each column a gentle curve, making them thicker at mid-height. It's almost imperceptible, but it corrects the distortion, making the columns look perfectly straight and perfectly strong. Even the corner columns are adjusted. They're slightly thicker and set a bit closer to the adjacent columns than the rest. Why? Because against the open sky, corner columns catch more light and tend to look thinner and farther apart. So the design compensated. It's visual psychology carved into stone. Altogether, the Parthenon is one giant optical illusion. A building designed not for abstract perfection, but for perceived perfection. It's not about geometry. It's about human vision. And what that tells us is extraordinary. It tells us that the architects weren't just builders. They were thinkers, artists, empiricists. They understood the gap between what is true and what feels true, and they bridged it with marble. Let's take a moment here to remember that this was 438 BC. That's nearly 2,500 years ago. long before what we now consider to be the formal discovery of perspective during the Renaissance, and long before geometry and optics were formalized into scientific disciplines well over a millennium later. Much of the optical knowledge embedded in this building about how humans perceive space, depth, and proportion would be forgotten for centuries. Many of the principles the architects were using here wouldn't be studied again until thinkers like Alhazen, Brunelleschi, or Alberti revived them almost 2,000 years later. But for all its geometry and optical sophistication, the Parthenon wasn't just about shape, it was about story. And nowhere is that clearer than in its sculpture. Let's start inside, with the statue of Athena Parthenos, designed by Phidias. As I mentioned earlier, it stood nearly 12 meters tall, made of gold and ivory, over a wooden core. She wore a helmet, carried a spear, and in one outstretched hand held a figure of Nike, the goddess of victory. This wasn't just a devotional statue. It was a monument to power. The gold alone was removable and could, in theory, be melted down in times of crisis, making the statue something like a divine treasury. And Athena herself, in full armor, wasn't just protecting the city. She was the city, its guardian, its patron, and its pride. Step outside and the storytelling continues. The metopes, those small, high-relief panels set above the outer columns, circle the building like a mythological comic strip. There are 92 of them in total. And nearly everyone shows a battle. Greeks versus Amazons. Lapiths versus centaurs. Gods versus giants. Trojans versus Greeks. On the surface, they're mythic, but underneath, they're political. Each of these battles pits order against chaos, civilization against savagery. And in every one, the Athenians stand in for the Greeks. The message is clear. We are the bringers of order. We are the defenders of culture. And our enemies, be they Persians or anyone else, are the forces of barbarism. Then there's the frieze, a continuous band of low-relief sculpture that wraps around the inner chamber. It's long, elegant, and deeply strange. Most scholars agree it depicts the Panathenaic procession, a religious festival held every 4 years in honor of Athena. But here's what makes it special. This isn't a myth or a legend. It's contemporary life. Horsemen, musicians, elders, maidens, all shown in idealized motion, participating in a civic ritual. This was radical. Gods and heroes were one thing, but ordinary Athenians, immortalized in stone, taking part in a sacred ceremony, that was new. It placed the city itself, not just its myths, but its people, at the center of its religion, its culture, and its destiny. Finally, we look up to the pediments, those massive triangular spaces at either end of the roof. The east pediment showed the birth of Athena, fully formed and armored, emerging from the head of Zeus, while the west pediment depicted her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of Athens, a moment that, according to legend, ended with Athena offering the olive tree and securing her place as the city's namesake. Together, these sculptures weren't just decoration. They were a campaign, a visual manifesto, a narrative that told Athenians who they were, where they came from, and why their city mattered more than any other. In marble, the Parthenon made its case. Athens is order. Athens is reason. Athens is chosen. The Parthenon stood in gleaming white marble for centuries. But like all things built by human hands, it didn't escape the tides of history. By the 5th century AD, the statue of Athena had vanished, probably looted or dismantled. The temple was converted into a Christian church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Pagan sculptures were defaced or removed, gods became saints, and myths were rewritten. Then came the Ottoman Empire, and the building changed faiths once again. By the 15th century, the Parthenon had become a mosque. Even a minaret was added to one corner. But the real tragedy came in 1687. During a war between the Venetians and the Ottomans, the Parthenon was being used as an ammunition depot when a Venetian cannonball struck the powder magazine inside. The explosion tore through the center of the structure, killing hundreds and reducing much of the building to ruin. The roof collapsed. Columns toppled. Sculptures were shattered or lost forever. What had stood for 2,000 years was gutted in seconds. And then, in the early 1800s, came Lord Elgin, a British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. With permission from the authorities and amid great controversy, he removed large portions of the Parthenon sculptures, including the best preserved metopes and frieze panels. They were shipped to London and sold to the British Museum, where they remain today as the so-called Elgin marbles. To this day, they are at the center of one of the most passionate cultural debates in the world. Greece has long demanded their return. Britain has refused. And the Parthenon, in a sense, has become a symbol of that argument, of how we treat heritage, who it belongs to, and what restitution really means. And yet, even in ruin, the Parthenon endures. It remains a symbol of Western civilization, of democracy, and of idealized beauty. Architects have copied it, politicians have posed before it, and tourists climb the Acropolis every day to see its battered columns glowing in the Mediterranean light. But the real legacy of the Parthenon isn't just in its shape or its survival. It's in its message, that a building can speak not only to gods, but to people. And that architecture isn't just stone. It's history, it's memory, it's myth. And that's the end of today's episode. I'm Liam Karen, and it's been a pleasure taking you on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. It all helps. Until next time, keep looking up.